Tee ourselves up for the CPI number stateside. Let's bring in Carl Tannenbaum, Chief Economist at Northern Trust. I'm delighted to say he joins us around the desk here in Singapore this morning. Carl, welcome. PPI, in terms of it being a prelude to a potentially equally hot CPI number, where does that leave repricing for the Fed?
Well, when it comes to American inflation, unfortunately, Sri, we're on a bit of a losing streak. After showing great progress in the second half of the last year, this year has provided a bit of a reversal. The Fed has, as in Chair Powell's words, has lost some of its comfort that inflation will descend comfortably towards the 2% target. They want to see sustainable progress, and when you put those words into a timeline, you're now thinking 3 or 4 months before they'll have accumulated information sufficient to get them comfortable with lowering rates.
Last mile is always admittedly the hardest, but is inflation on the path towards the Fed's 2% target? When does it get there? And if this is a goal that is not necessarily set in stone, then can the Fed afford to let inflation run a little hotter?
A lot to unpack there. Let me work backwards. So the Fed has been very serious about its 2% target. Remember, everybody, that it is an average, so they don't have to get all the way to 2%, and certainly they can be on the way into some band around it that they average. So it isn't necessary we get all the way to the target level. That said, there's been no sign from the Fed that they're willing to relax that target at all. They don't feel that they're taking an economic risk at the moment because growth has been good, employment is still pretty steady, so the downsides to keeping rates higher for longer just isn't there.
And Carl, you know, interesting, Fed Chair Jay Powell tried to reassure markets after that hot PPI print, and I think he was trying to get our attention focused more on the prior month, which was actually revised down.
Yeah, and producer prices, while they're important to watch, certainly aren't the summary measure that the CPI is or the Fed's favored measure, the deflator on personal consumption expenditures. Both of those are hovering year over year at around 3%. So to Shree's point, we're within shouting distance. We should be able to get there. It's just going to take longer than we thought.
Expectations for the CPI print?
So I think we're looking at something that's going to come in at about 2.5, 3/10. That's still going to be uncomfortably high. The data just aren't providing the comfort on services, whose prices are still elevated. And housing's been a frustration. The United States includes housing to a much greater degree in the inflation indicators than other countries. And while we've been expecting things to come down because online measures of rent have been doing so for well over a year, the official numbers have been stubborn.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you think PCE is probably a better metric or a better read? Because, I mean, housing accounts for about, if I'm not mistaken, almost half of that, right?
Yeah, there's a reason the Fed favors that, because it reacts with what people are buying. So if one thing gets more expensive, we as consumers can substitute to another and hold down our sense of inflation. The PCE does that interactively. The CPI, as you probably know, only updates its basket once a year or so. So that's why the Fed tends to favor it.
In terms of the counterfactual and the case against higher for longer, when you consider possibly emerging cracks within the consumer and reflecting on the disappointment that we saw with the April jobs number, the labour market potentially softening as well, is this telling us that the Fed is being too restrictive, they've oversteered, something is breaking in the economy and it's high time to start cutting?
So breaking might be an extreme. Certainly things are settling, as I thought through the job report that we got. It's not bad. 80,000 jobs in a month is enough to keep our unemployment rate constant. So we beat that bar, but we did see an increase in jobless claims and a decline in the number of open posts. The signs of the labor market settling down but not crashing are probably more accurate. So again, I think the Fed is watchful, but they don't see cracks yet.
So for the record, how's for you, Northern Trust? September start, how many cuts this year?
September, December is what we have for 2024. I think if I'm wrong, they'll be deferred a little bit further just because the economy has beaten expectations for 7 quarters in a row.
So no cuts this year?
That's the alternative case that I'd be looking at.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a non-negligible risk of one more rate hike if inflation continues to be a problem?
Powell says no.
And Jay Powell tried to take that off the table. I wouldn't assign it any more than a 5% likelihood. Again, their preference would just be to keep rates where they are for longer rather than have to hike.
All right, so we can start talking about this now. I'm sure we'll be continuing to talk about it through this hour, if not this morning, right? The spike in tariffs on Chinese imports, EVs, EV bats, solar cells, semiconductors. I mean, it's a long list. And I think what folks didn't notice was tariffs imposed by President Trump on China, President Biden decided to say, hey, look, we'll let those stay. So, of course, we've been talking about potentially what it could mean for the inflation picture in the U.S., especially because, you know, with these tariffs, somebody said, look, a good way to think about it is it's like squeezing a balloon. One part gets smaller, but another part, you know, it starts to expand. So we're talking about Mexico, Vietnam, Venezuela, all these sort of other third country places where the imports go through and still end up in the U.S. Are you expecting more action on that front to cut those routes off?
That's certainly going to be an election year issue. One of the things I've been mentioning to our clients here in the region is that of all the economic issues that will be debated in our election, trade is probably the one on which the two parties are most similar. I think they view China's practices as being a little bit nationalistic. China has stimulated the supply side of its economy again, and so they're overproducing things like steel, and so to the Americans, they're viewing that as something that they need to respond to. The other category of tariffs is falling under the heading of industrial policy. Everybody wants to be first and best with chips. Everybody wants to be first and best with EVs. And because China is promoting its own sectors in those space so actively, other countries, including the United States, feel the need to do the same.
All right, Carl, a lot more to talk about. Stay right there. Carl Tannenbaum. We'll continue with him coming up in just a short while. Meantime, we were just talking about these details on those